Every expectant mother knows that what she eats impacts her baby. And now research shows that is also true for our cows. Maternal consumption of Niasher during late gestation had a positive effect on the in utero calf, setting her up for better health and potentially even higher milk production once she joins the milking string. Learn more at balchemanh.com/launch and launch your herd for life.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Scott Sorrell, Director of Global Marketing for Balchem, and welcome to the Real Science Lecture Series. Calves are one of your most important resources since they are the future of your herd. Today, we'll be discussing what's next in calf management advancements. I would now like to introduce Dr. Bob James. Dr. James is an industry-leading expert on calf feeding and management. He's a professor emeritus of dairy science at Virginia Tech University and has a calf and heifer consulting business called Down Home Heifer Solutions, which specializes in providing timely management advice to calf and heifer raisers. He brings a lifetime of experience in research and extension in calves and the very latest on calving management, feeding pre and post weaning, individual versus group-based systems, accelerated growth, on-farm pasteurization of milk for calves, and a lot more. Dr. James, you should now have control of the screen.
Okay, good. I think this is very appropriate, and I think that Balchem mentioning the next generation, because that's what we're going to be dealing with today. And our topic is optimizing your calf program, and what does the future hold for you. I want to do a little bit different approach. And I think a lot of times when we hear a calf talk, we talk about biology and feeding. I want to broaden this just a little bit and look at calves in the context of our dairy industry and some of the challenges or the opportunities that we have. And I think more and more we need to look at calves from a consumer perspective and how we are perceived. So what are some of the issues that are driving our industry? Improved financial management. And let's look at these in the context of our calves. In the past, minimizing costs, or do we optimize our returns? Are we looking, and many times, we're just trying to survive till tomorrow, but we really need to look at what we do to these calves that has a long-term impact on the future of that herd. Sometimes when we hear the term animal welfare, we shrug up a little bit. And quite frankly, I think there's some research where this can be a win-win situation. And labor, the availability, the effectiveness, the efficiency, we're increasingly challenged with this on the farm, and I think this applies to calves. Technology, data. For calves, I want to look at minimum lag. In other words, what can I know today that tells me about how my calves are doing? What data can I have that lets me make decisions proactively? And I think a lot of times the problem that we have quite frequently with data is that we have so much that we just get lost in the weeds. So how do we focus on that data that's really, really important? And I think finally we need to look at what's the impact of the calf program on our nutrient management plan. This is important. So the primary goal of all heifer rearing programs is to raise the highest quality heifer that's going to maximize profits when she enters the herd. And this, I think, has changed significantly during my tenure in the dairy industry. I don't want any limitations that detract from her ability to produce milk under today's farm management systems. And we'll deal a little bit with, I think, some of those serious concerns. I want to optimize profits by obtaining the highest quality for the lowest possible cost in the least amount of time. And I think one of the key things now that's particularly changed in the last 5 or 6 years, I want to raise the number of heifers that I need to meet the goals of my business. And everyone's goals are a little bit different. So I show this picture because there's wide differences in what our expectations are and what our resources are in terms of managing calves. Let's talk a little bit about financial management as it applies to calves. I think historically, we look at that calf and boy, she is expensive to care for on a daily basis. So we've done this by, we've limited milk. We've tried to wean them early because milk's expensive. The labor involved is expensive. And I think this has led to the evolution of calf ranches. And don't get me wrong, the economy of scale, our calf ranches, our successful calf ranches have been very, very good at developing protocols to minimize some of those costs. And I think we've seen an evolution in some calf ranches from those that are strictly low cost to those that are, I think, optimum value and maybe a little bit higher cost. So what about optimizing returns? Well, I was really fortunate to be very actively involved in the Dairy Calf and Heifer Association, and I want to focus on a couple of things, some key goals. One is survival. Instead of talking about mortality, we talk about survival, and 95% survival during that first 60 days of life. But it's a whole lot more than just survival. Let's look at pre-weaning morbidity, and I want to focus mainly on respiratory disease. We want less than 10% incidence of respiratory disease. Well, how do we define that? Is that a treated animal? I want to pay special attention to Dr. Terry Olivet at University of Wisconsin, because I think she has really helped us to realize some of the challenges that we have in diagnosing respiratory disease and really developing the use of ultrasounding lungs of calves. If we look at some large data sets, we can look at the impact of respiratory disease on performance. Some work that we actually did at Virginia Tech looking at a large data set. When we treated calves more than twice, we reduced herd life. Some work from Alex Bach also looked at increased treatings, resulted in the odds of that animal not completing that first lactation. So what about growth rate? Well, if we look at our DCHA goals, they're to double the birth weight by 56 days. And so for an 85-pound Holstein calf, that's only 1.5 pounds of gain a day. Now, what's the genetic potential for growth? And I think, quite frankly, for Holsteins, most Holsteins, it's probably well over 2 pounds a day. And we do know, looking again at data, that heifers that completed the second lactation, their second lactation, grew more between days 12 and 65 of age than those that did not. Some work out of New York that looked at a very high relationship between average daily gain, and for every pound of average daily gain, we saw 850 to 1,100 pounds more milk in that first lactation. So there are things that we can do for that calf that have a great impact on their later performance. And I think that's probably one of the most exciting things that I've seen during my career. Now, how do we optimize returns? Well, I want to get us to change our focus instead of cost per day to cost per pound of gain. And if we break that down and look at nutrient requirements, essentially for that calf, she has requirements for maintenance and for growth. And the more the nutrition goes towards maintenance, the less that's left over for growth. And so here's a slide that I've copied. It was by Robert Corbett, and it was in the May issue of Dairy Herd Management. And it shows a couple of key things that I think we want to look at. First of all, if we look at comparing two different feeding rates, one was 2 quarts twice daily, essentially 1 pound of milk solids. The other one was 3 quarts 3 times a day, and that's about 2¼ pounds of milk solids. Now, what we show is what it costs for every pound of gain. And the key thing to notice here is as we increase feeding rate, look at what happens to the cost per pound of gain. And why does this happen? Well, that's because there's more nutrition left over to support growth. Now, if we look at different feeding rates, here's the old standby of a 2020 milk replacer, and quite frankly, that's very expensive. And this is under thermoneutral conditions too for that calf, so she really doesn't have to worry about staying warm. And a 2020 milk replacer may be very cheap on a daily basis, but it doesn't support very good growth. As we increase the protein, look at what happens to the cost per pound of gain. Now, if we move over to the 3 quarts 3 times a day, look at what happens to our cost per pound of gain. Now, we see some kind of funny things with the fat, and I think that largely depends upon what the environmental conditions are, and we have another slide to look at that. Now, some additional questions. Do we feed whole or waste milk? What is the cost of waste milk? And I get kind of upset when people say it's free. No, it isn't. It costs you money to produce that milk. And the more waste milk you have, the more it costs you to ship that milk out the door. And what is the cost of pasteurizing? And so I think these are some things that really must be considered. So here's the impact of environment on growth. And at colder temperatures, energy is diverted from growth to maintenance. So we have less efficiency and higher cost per gain. So I have an example here of either feeding 4 or 8 quarts of milk, and we have environmental temperatures from 68 degrees to 40 degrees to 20 degrees. And if we look at 4 quarts of milk, and if it gets down to 20 degrees, there's not enough energy to support any growth at all, because she's diverting it all just to keeping warm. And so there's nothing left over, and that animal is actually losing weight. And look at what happens to our cost per pound of gain. And it goes from $1.81 to $4.27 when we go to that colder temperature. If we double the amount of milk, look at what happens to our cost per pound of gain. And so we have some real significant benefits there. So in colder temperature especially, it's important to feed those calves more. Now, what's gain? Is it muscle? Is it protein? Is it fat? Is it ash or bone? Some of it's water. Or is it fill and just the digestive contents? And I fear that some of our early work that we did with calves, where we saw particularly good gains on older animals that were still being fed milk, well, some of that was just the calf starter that was residing within the digestive fill. So really, to know about body composition, we must examine these calves. This was some work we did at Virginia Tech to look at actually developing a milk replacer. The kidney on the left was from a calf that was fed a 2020 milk replacer. These are from out of 5-week-old calves. The kidney on the right was from a calf that was fed whole milk. Now, my question to you is, when that animal gets sick, what do? They eat less. What does it do to their energy requirements? It increases. And so this animal on the left that's been fed the 2020 milk replacer has very little body fat to serve as a resource for energy for that animal. And so I think we've really neglected the importance of body condition in pre-weaned calves. And I use this as an example. What is normal pre-wean nutrition for mammals? If we look at that horse, if we look at the calf, we've never limited milk to try and wean these animals early. And I think we really need to look at that and how we have fed dairy calves historically. And so we have a compromise between our cost per day and really what's best for that calf. And I think one of the themes that I have is that we want to do what's best for that calf and then what's best for the long-term performance of that animal. So how do we optimize our returns? Well, I think one of the biggest things in optimizing our returns is raise what you need. It used to be that if we did a really good job of raising calves and we had more heifers than we needed, we could always sell the surplus. Well, some work from Cornell, and granted this was work from New York, they estimated from farm records that the cost of raising an animal, a dairy heifer, to calving was somewhere between $2,000 to $2,600. The May 7th USDA from the USDA data shows that sales or cost that you could buy a springing heifer was about $1,000. So selling surplus heifers under almost all conditions is not very profitable. So you need to raise what you need. You do that by controlling the involuntary culling in your herd. We want to minimize calf mortality. We also want to optimize the potential of what you raise. That means we want to feed these calves so that they realize their genetic potential. Do we turn on some genes during this milk feeding period that make them better cows? And I think we do. By feeding them better, do we minimize the impact of disease or their ability to recover from it? The other thing on optimizing returns, I'm a very risk-averse person. If we're buying replacements because of our calf program is insufficient, we run the risk of purchasing some disease problems. So let's look at optimizing returns and look at facilities. Well, the calf hutch has been viewed as the gold standard. I think one of the challenges, excuse me, from calf hutches the labor involved in feeding the liquid diet, the calf starter, the bedding, the sanitation. What's the impact of weather on labor and retention of that labor? What's the impact of weather or environment on calves? How do we manage shrink in liquid and dry feeds that we feed to that calf? How do we maintain the quality of the liquid and the dry feed? And these things are all so important as we think of the big picture of taking care of these calves. I think pictures show it very well. What's the impact of environment? Now, maybe that calf's pretty well insulated with all that snow piled up around it, but cold weather has a tremendous impact on that calf. Now I can look at the other side and look, what's the impact of heat stress on calves? And we really are starting to understand some of the impact of that. And so these things influence nutrient requirements. What about the impact on labor effectiveness? Now, if you look on the left, there's actually a person back in there trying to treat that calf. Look at the picture on the right, early morning feeding calves. Not the most desirable conditions for the labor. And I think these are things that are especially important now that labor sourcing is such a challenge for us. This is something that just always concerns me tremendously, and that's the impact of shrink on the feeds that we have for calves. Calf hutches are great, but calf starter is very, very important. And how do we control shrink? And I think this is something we've largely ignored in our calf feeding programs. So shifting again just a little bit, let's look at calf welfare and the consumer perceptions of how we raise our calves. And there's been a tremendous amount of work that's been done and published in scientific literature that the consumer really identifies with the care we provide with calves. If we look at the left, actually a very well managed calf operation out in the West, but the consumer perception of that is probably not very favorable. But look at the condition on the right, where we see calves in a group housing situation, and they look good, they're running around, and these are important things. Now, one of the interesting things is that we've now noticed that there's an impact of our management systems on calf performance and consumer perceptions. Calves that are raised in pairs or group housed, they start eating starter earlier because their buddies show them. They adapt better to novel situations, and there's published research on this. They're less scared about new situations. Weaning is much less stressful on these animals. They've already been in a group. And when we look at moving calves from a hutch situation or an individual pen to group housing, we're multiplying the stresses. We have the housing, we have feed changes that are occurring. We're usually going to be moving that animal. And so this stress there's a whole lot less stress involved in these situations. Research shows it, and I think we've seen it in progressive farms that have adapted either the paired or the group housing. Does this have an impact on their behavior as cows? I personally think it does. There's some anecdotal information about this, but particularly if we look at some of our robotic dairies, if a calf is adapted to a robotic calf feeder, does that mean she's a little bit more willing to go into a robotic milking system? But there's an impact, we do know, of how we care for our calves to how they respond to different situations. And here's another situation I think that we need to be very aware of. What about transporting calves to calf rearing facilities? And there are many farms, larger farms, for various reasons, who ship their calves off to a calf ranch. Well, how old are they at shipping? What's the length of the haul without feed or water? Now in the US, that's 28 hours. But shipping a 3 to 4 or 5 day old calf for more than 24 hours has got to be very much of a stress on that animal. And granted, I will say this, there are very good calf ranches who've developed outstanding protocols and are very, very successful. But I think it's something that's very difficult for us to justify or to defend to our consumers. Dairy Calf and Heifer Association, our current guidelines say 24 hours, then a 5-hour stop. AABP, the American Association of Bovine Practitioners, has some guidelines, and I've listed their source. Now, here's why I'm additionally concerned about this. If we look at in Canada in February of 2020, there were some new regulations that were developed. Calves may be transported for that many hours as long as dehydration and exhaustion are prevented. Well, that's a little bit nebulous. Once 12 hours is reached, they must be provided feed, water, and rest. And we have a lot of calves in the US that are shipped more than 12 hours. And here's the other kicker. Calves 8 days and under can't be transported and can't go to an assembly center. Now, I think we as an industry need to be prepared for the onset possibly of some of those regulations. And this is a concern, and I think we really can't afford to ignore it. Let's look at labor availability and the impact of immigration. Half of 2.4 million workers have been identified potentially as illegal. You can say, well, get green cards or H-2A. The pathways to doing this are expensive and challenging, and it's a real political situation that we've not been able to, I think, address real successfully. If we look at this, and this is another even bigger concern, the minimum wage and overtime. In Washington State, they estimate 200,000 ag workers. There are regulations that are proposed that over 40 hours a week, you're going to get overtime pay. In California, this is going to be phased in depending upon how many employees that you have. From 9.5 to 8 hours a day, they will specify overtime above and beyond that, and then phasing in from 55 to 40 hours a week. And this is a big concern. And if we look at what can we do to improve labor efficiency, and I want to talk about labor effectiveness and labor retention and people taking care of our calves. So I think here's a good example. Here's a line of hutches, and is the labor efficiency the same on the farm on the top and on the bottom? And I think not. If I had a choice of being the person feeding that calf, which one would I prefer to work in? So if we look at calf care tasks that can be very labor intensive, maternity, calving, colostrum harvest, storage, newborn care, navels, vaccinations, colostrum feeding and transport, milk prep, running the pasteurizer, storing the milk, milk replacer. And here's, quite frankly, one of the big advantages of milk replacer. We've just simplified things tremendously. Milk feeding, do we do a bucket or a bottle? And then how do we maintain a level of sanitation? Calf starter feeding, not only the labor, but how do we minimize some of the shrink on that? Health teams, housing, bedding, maintenance, and sanitation. My point in bringing these up is I think we need to look at the systems we have for taking care of our calves. Look at the two situations, and I think this is a classic one, of the one on the top, and how efficient and effective are these folks in feeding those calves as compared to the one on the right. You know, I remember on this farm, they were putting a bottle out, you know, faster than probably about one a second or every couple of seconds. We see bins there for calf starter storage, so it minimizes shrink or to some extent and simplifies feeding. Look at the one on the right. We're a great environment for those calves, but how would you like to be that person feeding calves in a bucket, a feeding calf starter? It's a big challenge, and the differences in labor efficiency and effectiveness are tremendous. Now, do you have a calf manager or a calf feeder? And here are some of the differences between the two. A calf manager, and I think as we look at larger operations, this needs to be a major concern. We need to have somebody who really is passionate about calf growth and welfare. They identify with that. They're open-minded to new technology and protocols. They're detail-oriented. They're fanatical about sanitation, about feeding precision and accuracy. They're observant. They really understand calf behavior and can detect that quickly. They like data. and they use it to better manage calves and making proactive decisions. I think on too many farms, we have calf feeders. They like routine. Same time of the day, same things. Let's not rock the boat. They're not especially flexible. You know, this is how we've always done it, and it's been successful, but how can we do it better? Maybe they're not great communicators, and this is a big problem I see with calves, is the fact that maybe the first time that the manager, the herdsman, knows we have a problem is when calves start dying. There's inconsistent record keeping, and we rarely use them. And we have relatively low expectations of our calf program. So the last category I want to look at is nutrient management, and this is a big concern. We need to include the young stop operation in our nutrient management plan. And this is a factor for many farms, in that the heifers have been moved off the farm so that we can milk more cows. But we must accommodate the contribution of nutrients from calf raising facilities. And when we look in some parts of our country, imagine a calf site with calf hutches. How do we collect the effluent from those calf hutches and safely do that and efficiently do that? And that's going to be a concern. I know it's a concern in the upper Midwest, but this needs to be on our radar screen. So we need to have facilities for calves and nutrient effluent management. You know, the top video up on the top, or the top picture, a greenhouse facility. Down through the middle of that, there runs a drop channel with a French drain. And so we're collecting all the effluent coming from those calves. Not very much, but we can accommodate that versus the situation that we have on the bottom. And how do we accommodate that? Because again, it's exposed to so much more of environmental moisture that just dramatically increases the amount of effluent we have to deal with. So how do you manage your calves? If we look at what manages, is to handle or direct with a degree of skill. Is to exercise, execute, administrative, the direction of a management of the business. How do we apply this to the calf enterprise? You know, what does the future hold? I guess one of the first things that I would say is the calf program important to your farm? And this is I think is something that we need to back up and consider. We've been very successful, I think, on a lot of farms with minimizing the cost of our calf program, because there may be other things that are keeping that cow from really exhibiting her genetic potential. I think when we start looking at some of the farms that we see with 30,000 pound herd averages with levels of production you rarely thought possible, if we back up and look at that, everything on the farm, they're also doing a great job with calves. So where's your calf program now? And where do you want it to be? And how are you going to get there? And so I think we need to look at more of a systems approach for this. What records do you have to monitor your calf program? As I've worked with dairies, and it's been very interesting making the transition from academia, where I was very science oriented, to working with farms on a routine basis. What's the status of your calf program today? And if I listened to some farms, they would talk about mortality. And that's probably not a very good indicator of the success of that calf program. Communication. How do the calves communicate to the calf feeder, to the calf manager? And maybe sometimes the calf manager and calf feeder might be the same. But how does that calf manager communicate to the herd manager or the herd owner? And I looked at developing some systems where the herd owner or the herd manager could look at a report in the matter of less than 5 minutes, say, things are looking pretty good today, and I don't think we need to worry about things. The veterinarian, I was really fortunate when I worked with farms in Wisconsin to have some truly outstanding veterinarians to work with as cohorts on their calf programs. And they developed some really excellent reporting systems because they want to know, are their treatments successful? And I think the other part of that communication team are some of the industry partners. They might be feed salesmen, they might be equipment, but we need to develop these teams. And one of the things that I did and I thought was successful is looking at developing a daily monitor. And I really found this by working with some of the larger farms. Maybe one of the best systems that we have, or best things that we have for calves, is how many calves are off feed this morning or are slow drinkers. And so I like to have a daily report that the manager can look at to really give them a snapshot picture right away. Now, in addition to that, we may have some weekly or some monthly reports. The vets really like to know how many treats do we have, and then how many retreats. Because not only what are we treating for, but then what's the success of our treatment. And I put down here ultrasound, and we're seeing a lot of farms adopting ultrasound to really detect pneumonia or respiratory disease in these calves. Here's an example. There's going to be 3 slides here that we developed, and I customized this to the farm, depending upon how many records they want and their degree of interest in that. Well, here's how many calves that we fed in the morning and the afternoon milking. Here's the pounds of milk that we took out of the tank, the pounds of water, and the pounds of milk replacer we put in there to finalize that solution. So there's my total solution. And there's the temperature of that solution when that truck left the barn. So the next part of that monitor, here's the temperature when the last calf was fed. And so how did we use this? Well, in the wintertime, we actually put an insulating blanket on that tank because 92 degrees is too cold for those calves. Now, here's probably the key one that I would look at if I was the herd manager. How many slow or non-drinkers did we have this morning and the afternoon? Here's the numbers, the tag numbers on the calves that were slow or non-drinkers or didn't finish all their milk. Now, maybe the manager doesn't care about that, but for the herd manager, but maybe for the calf manager, this is some vital information. So I want it to be real simple and very timely. Here's how many scouring calves, the number of respiratory calves, the number of navel calves, and the number of deads. So keep it simple. Keep it simple. So essentials for calf management. I want a calf management team. It's the feeders, the managers, the herd manager, the DVM, the industry partners. And so finding a way to communicate efficiently and effectively for that team so that everybody's pulling in the same direction. Where I've always encountered problems is where we don't have that communication, or if one of those members of that quote team really is not pulling in the same direction. I want to develop some records with minimal lag, which means I want to know trends as soon as possible and really that are relevant to achieving our goals, whether it be growth, health, or financial. And I want a commitment to improvement. So let's look at the impact of technology. One of the things is I never worked with too many of them, but the robotic dairies that are milking, are these herds managed a little differently? Yeah, they look at different indicators or different information coming from those robots. Now, can we apply this same mindset to managing calves? Well, that's one of the cool things is with the calves, we can get how much they drank, how fast they drank, if they broke off, how many unrewarded visits, and we can also record treatments. This is just an example of a record on a calf from the Forster Technic equipment. That's sold by Dealaval, Lely, and Gia. And so I have for that calf the time when it consumed a meal. I have level and percent. I have break-offs. I have drinking speed, and maybe drinking speed is one of my better indicators, and that's down here on the lower right. And when we see a change in drinking speed, that may be an indicator that we need to go back and look at that calf. Now, all those values are recorded 27, and they're accessible through the cloud. And so for the farms that I work with, I can see that information and hopefully be a better a better consultant. Now, the challenges with this is data overload. It's individual animal focused. It's great for somebody walking the pens, but as a manager, a consultant, or a DVM, I need to see trends in key measures. You know, tell me what the intake average is for this pen of calves, and is it going up or down? What's the trend in drinking speed? And how many animals were treated within that pen? So I'd like to see that on a pen basis and then on a farm basis so that we can understand that. I think one of the nice things about this automated collection is, boy, there's very minimal lag. And hopefully this is going to be related to long-term performance of those calves. I just show you this. This is actually a dairy comp report. And we talk about weighing calves at birth and weighing when they're weaned. And this was a large dairy that I've worked with. And so if we have 200, it means they've doubled their birth weight. Now, this was a real valuable tool because look at the spread in those calves. Unbelievable. Now, if we look at starting back in April of 2019, we see a lot of scatter. Well, actually in June, it was even worse, but that started to tighten, and look at the trend in those calves. So as a manager, as a consultant, we can see that we're having an impact on that program. And if I show you this farm even further, that scatter has gotten smaller and a lot tighter, and it's moved up in the direction to where we're achieving that 200. So a good example, I think, of using data in a very, very positive manner. So as we wrap up some things, what are the bottlenecks with your calf program? I guess one of the first things I would ask is your calf program important to your herd future? And for a lot of, unfortunately, for some farms, it's not a priority. If it is, then identify the bottlenecks, and they can be several. I think to me, the things that I look at, do I have the right people there? Do I have systems of doing things that are simple and easy to manage? And, you know, I showed all the different tasks involved in taking care of calves. You know, and probably one of the first things I look at is newborn care. And I want that calf born in a really pristine environment so that the first thing that enters its mouth is high quality colostrum with a low bacteria count. So what can I do to optimize feeding colostrum, optimizing preservation of that quality? You know, then I look into things that really make that calf feeder really enjoying their job and wanting to stay there really forever on the farm and just do nothing but get better. So we need, once we've identified our bottlenecks, I really want to prioritize those in terms of timeliness. Which ones can I improve that are going to have the most rapid impact on farm profit and sustainability, both now and in the future? And this has been one of the challenges with calves. We make a positive change now, and probably the only immediate thing that we see may be lower mortality. But what impact is it going to have on that animal becoming a better cow? And I'm confident we have the data now, or the information, that the better job we do with cows, the better they're going to be as cows. I want to develop a management mindset with calves. And that means developing a system to where we've got key information that tells us what's happening now and identifying trends in terms of our calf management. You know, and the other thing is, and I've finished this up on a lot of my presentations, we want to do what's best for your calves. You know, I challenge people occasionally and say, would you treat your child the way you've treated some of these calves? No, you wouldn't. And this is still a very young animal, and that's very easily or greatly impacted by the quality of the diet, the quality of the environment that we place them in. Key thing is taking care of that calf in maternity, and that probably the first 24 to 36 hours of that calf's life, and then providing the consistent and high quality nutrition for that animal to enable her to grow and develop. So let's optimize the calf program for the future. And that begins with the biology of calf growth and development. And we know that comes from not trying to skimp on nutrition, not trying to skimp on nutrition. And I know it's a difficult thing to look at because liquid diets are very expensive. But let's change our focus on calf cost per day to cost per unit of growth, because I think that's really the key measure of what we're looking at. We do know that the better growth of those calves, the better cows that they're going to be. Let's look at some things on calf behavior and how it might translate to cow behavior. And I think this is something real exciting as we look at the research that's been conducted at University of British Columbia. They've done really some groundbreaking research. University of Guelph in Florida, University of Florida. And what we do for calves, do they actually become better cows? This is a real exciting part of research right now. Look at labor efficiency, effectiveness, and retention. Labor is going to be increasingly a challenge, and how do we provide the system that enables people to do their job well and really enjoy what they're doing? We've got to consider nutrient management. We've got to be good stewards of the land, and I think that's particularly a problem as we look at some of our calf hut systems, particularly in environments where we're dealing with a lot of liquid runoff from our calf sites. And ultimately, it's got to be profitable. And I think we look at profit, and we need to look at really a return on our investment that we make with those calves. So with that, I really appreciate your time and look forward to questions that you folks might have.
Thank you, Dr. James. Before we get started answering questions, we'd like to share a brief video, and then we'll be right back to answer the questions submitted during today's presentation.
The heat of summer is coming, and it can have a big impact on your cows. Niasher precision-release niacin is the perfect complement to traditional heat abatement strategies to help keep her cool from the inside. Using Balchem's proprietary encapsulation process, Niasher delivers 8 times more bioavailability than raw niacin, leading to an increase in sweating and vasodilation to reduce internal body temperature and support maximum productivity. Learn more at balchemanh.com/cool and keep her cool from the inside.
As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions pane in the attendee control panel. Dr. James, your first question is, what % of heifer calves raised by contract growers have retained ownership of the heifers?
Oh, and this is just going to be a guess. I would say that probably contract growers, the owners probably retain overwhelmingly the majority of the ownership of those. I really, on the heifer side of things, don't know of any growers, that many growers who buy heifer calves and then sell them at some future time. So I'd say it's probably very low, but I really don't have any sound numbers on that. I guess that's just involved from my experience through DCHA and knowing a good many of the growers that are out there.
All right, thank you. Gert would like to know, how is the saturation of a milk-fed calf determined? Emptying of the abomasum, energy intake, glucose levels, etc.
Wow, that's a good question. Saturation, I guess maybe the word that I would use is satiety. Okay, and if we look at some of it's related to the abomasum, probably. There's really not been any very good work that's been done, I think, on calves. Let me just think about that one a little bit. The challenge that you have in answering that question is we have two different things. Historically, we fed calves twice a day. So I think in situations like that, probably the filling of the abomasum might be something that leads to how much milk that's going to consume. When we look at the automatic calf feeders, one of the programs that I really like to use is after the calf has developed a really good, strong appetite, we let them drink as much as they want. And so those calves, now what we do is we limit their intake to no more than 2 liters in a meal. And that meal will be, once they've drank 2 liters, they have to wait 2 hours before they can consume again. And I think this tells us really how much calves will drink, because in a farm that I work with and on a very routine basis now, it's in Virginia, they have automatic calf feeders, and they have calves that are drinking 17 liters a day, and very healthy. They grow, they do well. And, and historically we thought, oh boy, if we give them more than 2 gallons a day, we're going to overwhelm them. And I think the auto feeders have really told us an awful lot about what intake capacity is for calves. Now, in those situations, typically I like to limit intake then after about 30 days and start tapering it down so we get them stimulated to consume some calf starter. So I think initially it's probably a capacity thing for these really young animals, and it changes as they get older. But we really haven't done a whole lot of research on that. But I think that my experience with the auto feeders kind of tells me that they've got a pretty high intake capacity and do very well. These are very healthy calves too.
All right, thank you. The next question is, we're beginning to learn that the calf's health journey actually begins in utero. Can you talk a little bit about the importance and key learnings for taking care of the calf pre-calving?
Boy, I tell you, we've got some good listeners today. And I was interested in some of the information that you've had about heat stress and niacin. And quite frankly, that's another area of research that I think is very, very early. Does heat stress have an impact on the calf? Most definitely so. If we look at the research from Florida, and I believe 2 webinars before you had Jeff Dahl from Florida, is that right, talking about heat stress?
Yes, absolutely.
Scott? Yeah. And so, we know that dams that are heat stressed, generally the calves are born early, and there's an impact on those calves. But so far as studying the impact of nutrition on that, I think we're still in very, very early stages of that. And the challenge that we have with some of that research is that there might be a positive impact on that of how well we feed the dam. But then if we have a calving environment that's substandard, or a calf housing situation that's substandard, does that negate all the benefit that we get from better prepartum nutrition? So I guess my answer is that it's got to be a system all the way through where we optimize those things, and a breakdown in any one area can negate some of that process. But definitely heat stress has an impact, and I think very logically how well we feed that animal has an impact on it. What's the impact of prepartum nutrition on colostrum composition? And we're finding that it's a lot more sometimes than just the IgGs or the antibodies that are in there, but does it have another impact on some of the other non-immune components that are in colostrum that have an impact on that calf? So good question, difficult answer. And as you see, I'm not trying to beat around the bush, but to show the complexity of the situation that we're dealing with. But definitely this prepartum nutrition, I think, is going to have an impact on those calves.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Larry would like to know, what is your philosophy regarding vaccinations for calves before 2 months of age, injectable versus intranasal?
Well, I'm not going to avoid the situation. I am not a veterinarian, and so I am going to defer that question to veterinarians. And this is what I guess in my consulting business. And by the way, over the last several years, my business was strictly related to newborn calves. And one of the key things for me was developing a strong relationship with the veterinarian. And that included developing a vaccination program that was really very relevant to the situation at that farm. And I think the concerns we have there, is this a closed herd or have they brought in significant numbers of animals from outside? And I think that has a large impact on how we proceed with a vaccination program. The key part of that has got to be an outstanding colostrum program. I think the advantages that we know now of prolonged feeding of colostrum, there are some advantages there of feeding transition milk when that can be accomplished on the farm. Sometimes it's very challenging and maybe not be practical or very good. The other component that I really emphasize very strongly is that if we start developing some herd health problems with our calves, we must involve the veterinarian in doing some postmortems and doing some diagnostic work. That to me is absolutely critical. And without that, I think, we might be wasting our money. Yes, we're going to spend some money doing that diagnostics, but it can really result in the development of a much more effective and efficient herd health program with our calves. So this diagnostics and involvement of the herd veterinarian are just really, really very important. And, as I said, I want to emphasize the veterinarians that I worked with in Wisconsin were really unbelievably great partners to deal with. When COVID hit, I was limited in travel. In fact, this is my first trip that I've made since March of 2020. But I had some phenomenal veterinarians to work with, and we were just exceptional teammates in maintaining those calf programs for me, which was on a virtual basis.
All right, thank you for that. Donna would like to know, with pair feeding or group housing, what are the best practices to prevent cross-sucking?
Yeah, you've got to feed enough milk, and I think that's the key thing. And if you're feeding less than 8 liters of milk a day to that young calf, you're going to have problems with calf sucking, and that is very, very, very much paramount in preventing that problem of cross sucking. These calves have, particularly Jerseys, have oral problems, and so that's a really key thing. Where I see farms that particularly have the, if I want to call it the ad lib feeding, or allowing that calf to drink at least 12 liters of milk if they want to. Some calves drink 8 liters and that's all they really want to drink. And I see tremendous variation in intake preferences by calves. That's one of the advantages in the auto feeder situation, is that we can provide that oral stimulation that we do have. I think from a bucket feeding situation, that's going to be a real difficult one to manage in groups or pairs. If we're feeding with buckets, because they drink so fast, and then they're looking for something to suck on, and of course that's going to be the pair. So I think if we're looking at paired housing, and there's probably someone out there who can tell me that I'm wrong, because there's variation, but you almost always have to be in a bottle feeding situation. And in that situation, if we're limited to 8 quarts a day, then we ought to make sure that nipple doesn't have a hole that's too big, or an air bleed hole that's too large that they drink real quickly, so that they get some of that suck stimulation. I've seen the mob feeding of calves from headlocks or from and that can work fairly well. If we look at the acidified free choice systems that are particularly popular in Canada, that nipple's always there. and they've got something to drink whenever they want to. I think with the acidified situations, there's an adaptation period while they get used to the acid. And then once they do, you know, they're kind of off to the races, and they drink quite a bit. But it's been a real education for me, seeing, learning the, you know, what's really a normal behavior for these calves.
All right, thank you, Bob. The next question comes from Rodrigo, who's really enjoying your presentation, but he'd like to know your opinion on the practices of using foster cows to raise calves.
Mm-hmm. You know, I've seen that. I live in southwestern Virginia, and in fact, my major professor used to raise a few cows, and he'd have an older Holstein cow, and she'd foster raise several calves. Questions to ask is, you know, how much milk does mom have? And you almost need to tailor the number of calves that you have for that. They will. There's just a lot of variability. You know, she's a pretty good cow. She can raise quite a few calves. They develop maybe I would say a more normal calf behavior, and I put that in parentheses. But do we have some, excuse me, do we have some problems with them then identifying with the human side of things? And that's one thing that would concern me, is that if we're going to be working with these calves later on, there could be some real challenges. Now, in retrospect, there's some work that's being done in Europe, because one of the I guess the animal welfare concerns that we have is, you know, we're pulling these calves away from the cow, and some of the research that they do is to make this a little bit more practical. Is there certain times of the day where they turn the calves in with the cows, and then they remove them. And I think you can see some of the challenges that that can exist in those kind of scenarios, not only from but just from a management standpoint. Again, a lot of variability there. I apologize if I seem to lack a real clear-cut answer, but I think there's going to be a tremendous amount of variability. I would say to do it successfully is almost an art, and how you manage the behavior of the cow. Some of them are very willing to take on foster calves, and other ones not so much.
Very well. So I see we're getting to the top of the hour here, Dr. James. I'm going to end with one last question from Jeffrey. Jeffrey says that, you know, dairy producers spend a great deal of time and effort to pick the best semen that will improve their herd. And then when they get the end result, the calf, the same producer often doesn't use the same time and effort to raise it to its potential. How do we best convince our dairy producers to spend more time early on with the calves?
What was this fellow's name? Jeffrey?
Jeffrey,
if you can, yeah, Jeffrey, if you can figure that out, you're going to be an absolute genius. You know, I've been doing this for many years, and sometimes I feel like I'm beating my head against the wall. That, you know, people will buy the best semen. They may have ET calves, and then they want to try and minimize the cost of what they spend in raising that calf, and it's just a real challenge. I think the big challenge that we have is that what we spend on that calf, we really don't see it unless there's health problems until they calve. And I used to use the example to my students is I'd walk up to one of them and I'd kick them in the shins, and they pull their leg away right away. Well, the analogy with calves is I kick you in the shins, and about 2 years later, you pull your leg away. Folks don't see the association. How long have I been professing that we need to feed calves better? Need to feed them to meet their nutrient requirements, and it's a real big challenge. And I know this is true with others who've done calf research. The biggest thing that convinced me that we needed to do a better job of feeding calves is when we did a research that led to the development of the Jersey milk replacer with higher fat and higher protein. And we started harvesting calves at 5 weeks of age, and I looked at the body condition of these calves, and it was extremely telling. You know, we don't want to have dairy character, quite frankly, in a 8-week-old calf. I wanted to be a little chubby, and that goes against everything I think I was taught, when I started teaching about calf nutrition, and it's a huge challenge. It's human nature, as I say, that we look at what we're spending per day. It's like the cost of a milk replacer. Well, if it's a 2817, it's got to be the same quality of the different manufacturers. And generally, when a product is so much cheaper than something else, there's a reason for it. I guess that's one of my biggest frustrations that I deal with. The positive thing is I see the results from some really progressive farms, and they don't need to be convinced to invest more in their calves. But I don't have a simple answer, and it's probably one of my biggest frustrations of my career. That yes, we'll spend all this money, and then we don't try an optimizing harvest of that genetic potential.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. James, for a very interesting webinar today. And thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. If you have additional questions, please submit them to anh.marketing@balchem.com, and we'll forward them to you along with the unanswered questions from today's session. Our next webinar will be on June 8th, when Dr. Xavier Rousseau from AB Vista will outline the impact of enzymes and fiber in gut health. You can also join us on June 15th for our next companion animal-focused webinar, when Dr. Anna Kate Shoveler from the University of Guelph will review the formulation considerations for healthy dogs, investigating the impact of sulfur amino acids, taurine, and methyl compounds. But Balchem's podcast series continues to offer a deeper dive into our webinar topics. We now have 15 episodes out on YouTube, your favorite podcast platform, and at balchemanh.com/podcast. This podcast series goes behind the scenes to be a part of the conversation that takes place over a few drinks with friends. Search for Real Science Exchange on your favorite podcast platform and be sure to subscribe. On behalf of Balchem and Dr. James, thank you for joining us today.